Mr. and Mrs. Morris did not have children for a long time. The woman did everything, but nothing helped. So 10 years passed, and when the couple had almost lost hope, they had a long-awaited baby boy who was named Mason. The boy was born weak. He was constantly sick, often being in the hospital, and Mrs. Morris again and again prayed to God to send health and strength to their child. As the years went by, Mason grew up and got married. Brooke was 5 years older than him, had an obnoxious temper, and according to rumors, led a promiscuous lifestyle before marriage. But Mason was so much in love that he did not want to listen to anyone. Immediately after their wedding, the young couple decided to live in the parents' spacious house for a while until they could find something suitable for them. Soon, Mason told his parents that Brooke was expecting a baby. He was over the moon, was literally carrying his wife in his arms and looking forward to the arrival of an heir. But his parents just shook their heads silently. Brooke often went out of the house in her husband's absence, and to any remarks from his parents, she responded with rudeness. However, they did not dare to complain to their son about Brooke's behavior so as not to damage their relationship. But one day, Mrs. Morris couldn't stand it. "Son, you should be more strict with Brooke. She came home drunk from her friends yesterday. How can a pregnant woman drink so much?" But Mason didn't like the fact that his mother was judging his wife. Brooke, as always, insinuated to him that she was being undeservedly picked on. Brooke said, "It was her friend's birthday, and she only had half a glass of wine. What's wrong with that?" But she and her friend were walking down the street yesterday, staggering around, yelling songs to the whole neighborhood. Could one glass of wine do that? The father intervened in the conversation. "Talk to her. She can't behave like that while pregnant, or your mother and I don't want to know you anymore." Mason got angry at his parents and packed his bags and moved with his wife to live with a friend. Mrs. Morris was distressed and asked her husband to reconcile with their son, but he was adamant. He realized that if they showed weakness now and let their daughter-in-law act as she wanted, things would only get worse. Mr. Morris tried to explain to his wife that the son was responsible for his actions, and that only life could open his eyes to the truth. But his mother felt pity for their son and wanted to cuddle their grandchildren in the future. So she finally persuaded her husband to apologize and return her son and daughter-in-law home in exchange for a promise not to interfere in their personal lives anymore. Brooke returned to the house like a real queen, with her head held high and her nose turned up in importance. Last months they lived each in their own half of the house, trying not to cross or bump into each other. And finally, a beautiful girl was born who was named Lucy. But Brooke did not want to continue taking part in the baby's life. She refused to breastfeed the child and soon again began to leave home for long periods of time under various pretexts. Jason at first tolerated, but one day he could not stand it and reproached his wife for the fact that she completely shifted the care of the child on the shoulders of his parents. Upon hearing this, Brooke, without explanation, proudly packed her bags and left home. "Sonny, where is Brooke? The baby is constantly crying, and I need at least a little break, and I have a lot to do around the house as well," complained Mrs. Morris, exhausted from sleepless nights, to her son. "Mum, Brooke is gone, for good." Mrs. Morris looked at her son in confusion. She was frightened that Brooke would now take Lucy, but the son quickly reassured his mother, saying that his wife did not want the child. But Mason himself could not calm down so quickly. After a few days, he decided to seek out his unfaithful wife and persuade her to return. Realizing that it was useless, the mother did not try to dissuade her son, and he went off to look for her. He found her quickly. She was giggling impudently and stupidly in the company of drinking buddies at the other end of town. Mason got angry and, throwing his wife's buddies across the room, tried to take Brooke with him, but the woman desperately resisted. Mason tried to get Brooke to come to her senses and reminded her about the child, but the woman aggressively lashed out and hurled insults at her husband. At that moment, one of Brooke's drinking companions, who had just woken up, hit Mason on the head with something heavy, and the man collapsed on the floor. Mason woke up on the street. When he managed to get home, his mother wanted to call the police, but the son stopped her. He still loved Brooke and did not want her and her friends to be arrested, and the next day, he heard from her friend Candy that Brooke sobered up, had left town in a hurry. Time passed and Mason, whether from homesickness for Brooke or from a head injury, began to drink more often. Father and mother tried in vain to give his son back the joy of life. Only communication with his little daughter allowed him to forget about his loneliness for a while and not touch the bottle. Charming baby girl gradually grew. She had already taken her first steps and began to call her grandmother her mother. Mason was laughing happily, watching as the puffy baby waddled awkwardly towards him, stretching out her cute little hands. At such moments the grief of unrequited love and betrayal receded, and he was happy again. Trouble came from whence it was not expected. One day Candy, passing by and watching Mason walking with Lucy, as if in jest, said that Brooke, as a cuckoo, dropped off her daughter to him, and he was silly enough to raise another man's child for a year. At first Mason didn't even understand what she was talking about, but Candy explained, and from her story it became clear that Brooke got pregnant by a boyfriend from the big city, and when he found out about the pregnancy, he immediately rushed to break up with her. Mason had been her second choice the whole time, which she took advantage of. It all seemed true because Lucy was born, as Brooke assured him, 8 months old. When Mason rushed home with the baby in his arms, it was scary to look at him. Mrs. Morris rushed to take the baby away from her son and asked what happened. "Lucy is not my daughter," yelled the man, flashing his eyes madly. "She gave me someone else's baby." "How can she not be yours? What are you speaking?" interrogated the mother in horror. Candy said, "I must find Brooke and know the truth, otherwise I'll just go crazy." Mrs. Morris had no time to stop her son, and he jumped into the car and drove away. He was gone for 2 days, and on the 3rd day a policeman came to the house and told the shocked parents that Mason was dead. He probably found his wife, who confirmed what Candy had said. Then the man got drunk with grief, drove, had a car accident and died on the spot without regaining consciousness. The deserted parents mourned their only and such long-awaited son for a long time. They decided to keep taking care of Lucy, although most probably she was not their biological granddaughter. The years passed. Mr. and Mrs. Morris were gradually getting older, and Lucy was becoming more and more like her mother, despite all the love and care which the elderly couple had surrounded her with. The girl grew up ungrateful and cruel, was rude to her grandmother, and did not take her grandfather's opinion into account. One day the elderly man had a serious talk with his granddaughter, but in response, Lucy only proudly, as her mother had once done, turned up her nose and said, "How much you piss me off. You think I do not know that you are nobody to me. I know everything. Somebody in town told me everything a long time ago, so be thankful I live here with you." Mrs. Morris could not bear such cruel words, and the woman had a stroke. While Mr. Morris tried his best to put his beloved wife back on her feet, paying for the rehabilitation, Lucy finally got out of control. So when he found out that the 18-year-old girl had started living with a former convict, 20 years older than she was, he only sighed bitterly and gently said to his wife, "Well, honey, we did the best we could. We have nothing to reproach ourselves for. We loved Lucy and took care of her. It's not our fault she can't return the favor. You, my dear, must get well now by all means. Don't leave me alone." At first, Mrs. Morris was recovering a little. The therapy seemed to help. But one early morning, Mr. Morris saw his beloved lying in bed looking at the ceiling with glassy eyes. The elderly man cried with grief and hopelessness, not understanding how and for what he had to live further. After the funeral, Mr. Morris became homesick. He constantly thought of his wife and son, who had left him so early. Lucy did not come to her grandmother's funeral, and grandfather did not hear from her for almost 6 months. But one day the granddaughter showed up at the door with her boyfriend. As it turned out, she needed money, and she demanded that Mr. Morris should sell the house. "What are you doing, granddaughter? We loved you so much, and now you want me to stay on the street," said Mr. Morris, trying to get through to her heart. "Oh, I'm not your granddaughter. You're nobody to me. But according to the documents, the house will still be mine after your death. So, what's the holdup? We'll take you to a retirement home and you'll live out your days there. And I need the money now," Lucy said in a drunken voice. The girl hoped that, frightened by the pressure and menacing appearance of her boyfriend, her grandfather would sign the necessary papers for the house. But Mr. Morris was not so easily frightened. "You won't get anything. Get out of here, you ungrateful girl," muttered Mr. Morris angrily, slowly retrieving a shotgun from its safe. Lucy and her boyfriend left hurriedly, cursing the old man, and Mr. Morris tiredly sat down on the porch and for the 1000th time began to think about the question that had been tormenting him for many years. How it had happened that Lucy, a tender little girl, had turned into a heartless wretch. After these events, Mr. Morris became ill more often, fading with ennui and not finding the strength to go on living. One day, a neighbor, noticing that Mr. Morris had not shown up in the yard for days, knocked on his door and, when no one opened, called an ambulance and the police. When they broke down the door, they found the elderly man lying in the middle of the hallway. He was unconscious, and no one knew how long he had been there. They took him to the hospital and began to look for relatives. After he had suffered a stroke, Mr. Morris needed good care, but Lucy, who arrived immediately, made it clear that she was not going to take care of grandfather and that she was only interested in the inheritance. After hearing all the prognosis, Lucy turned around and left the hospital. The doctors and the rest of the nursing staff were horrified by this heartless behavior, but then one of the young nurses approached Mr. Morris and whispered softly, "Mr. Morris, do you recognize me? I'm Megan. Remember me? I used to come to your house to give your wife her injections." Mr. Morris nodded. He remembered the young nurse who had come to them. "Don't you have any relatives left at all except Lucy?" asked Megan again. Mr. Morris nodded again, and tears glistened in his eyes. Seeing this, Megan decided to distract him from his sad memories. "Do you remember? I came to you a couple of times with my son Tommy. You made him a gun out of a piece of wood back then. He still remembers you. I'm an orphan. I have no parents. So Tommy has no grandparents. He's been thinking of you as a grandfather ever since and sometimes asks when he'll see you again. So I have an idea. Let me take you with me. We rent a small apartment, but I'll find a place for you. And when you feel better, you will decide for yourself what to do next, to stay with us or go home." So Mr. Morris found a new family. He was recovering hard after all the years were taking their toll. But Megan's caring hands did their work, and the elderly man slowly went on the mend. Patrick, an old friend of Megan's, who worked as a masseur at a local clinic, helped a lot. He came to Megan's house every evening, massaged the elderly man and worked on his paralyzed body part, and then Megan fed everyone a delicious dinner. By the way, the man always blushed and was timid at the sight of Megan. Mr. Morris immediately realized that he was secretly in love with her. One day he asked Patrick why he would not make any move if he loved Megan, and Patrick confessed he was terrified of rejection. Then the elderly man promised to carefully find out from Megan what she really thought of Patrick. 6 months later, strengthened and happy, Mr. Morris returned to his large house, and not alone, but with the newlyweds and little Tommy. Life began to bubble up again inside the orphaned walls. Megan planted flowers and arranged the garden, while Patrick and Mr. Morris made repairs and then added an annex to the house, since the young couple were expecting an addition to the family. The only one who was displeased was Lucy. She was furious, having found out from her friend that her grandfather was not only alive and healthy, but also started a new family. The angry granddaughter came to her native town with another boyfriend, and then she entered the yard. She attacked Megan with insults like a fury, but then Patrick appeared behind her, clenching his fists furiously. There is nothing scarier than a silent, phlegmatic man when in front of him someone insults his beloved woman. Lucy's boyfriend took one look at Patrick, cursed and cowardly disappeared behind the gates of the house. He started the car and hurriedly called out to Lucy, but she only stared dumbfounded at her grandfather and his new family. "Grandpa, what does all this mean?" "It means I'm alive, and I'm not going to die, and I gifted the house to Megan a long time ago." Realizing that there would be no money from the sale of the house, Lucy's boyfriend rushed away, raising a cloud of dust, and Lucy, stumbling and swearing, waddled alone to the bus stop. Mr. Morris grinned and then, taking Tommy's hand, went with the boy to the river. He had promised to build him a fishing rod and to go fishing long ago, and the boy, who loved the elderly man with all his heart, did not leave the elderly man's side for a minute. Tommy was happy, walking hand in hand with his grandfather, and Mr. Morris was happy that in his old age, God had given him such a friendly family. "I'm happy,"